When I left art school, I very quickly found the issue that most artists find out, which is you have to find out where the money comes from if you're going to have any kind of sustainable practice. And that I worked in various capacities as a kind of artist and designer for kind of some small and big operations. But like a lot of my contemporaries, you find yourself filling out application forms in the first instance to the Arts Council and starting to really think about, well, actually, who's going to pay for this stuff? And, who's going to pay for the context in which it exists, and what are its operating costs? And you start to think about the bigger sort of contextual environment that artistic practice exists in. So that was the first kind of hurdle to come over. And that, over a period of time, I found myself still working within the cultural sector, but spending a lot of time thinking about actually how's this kind of stuff pay for itself. And which led me to kind of specialise increasingly in philanthropy, in fundraising, in sponsorship, looking at business planning within arts organisations. So I started to work within English National Opera, was one of my kind of first big fundraising jobs, looking at the restoration of the London Coliseum. So that was a kind of immediate fit because I'd specialised in public art and architecture, and I was kind of knowledgeable about the sort of theory and practice of that. So that was a good thing to be fundraising on. And that's led on to a series of progressively more involving fundraising roles at places like Sadler's Wells and the National Art Collections Fund, and most recently now, for the last 2.5 years, at WWF, which is the Worldwide Fund for Nature. I am responsible across legacies and government fundraising and private philanthropy, probably 12 to 15 million pounds worth of income for WWF. We spend a lot of time thinking about, well, actually, how can we convey these big cultural, complex messages like climate change, which are themselves big abstractions, in ways which are very punchy and marketable and are going to reach the maximum number of people. So, in a sense, who better to deal with abstractions than fine artists? You know, and I think fine artists are very comfortable with the idea, and arts practitioners and arts lovers or consumers or collectors are very comfortable with the idea. You can stand in front of a canvas, and you're talking about spirituality or philosophy or kind of bigger, deeper cultural coded issues. So when you want to talk about climate change itself is quite a kind of dry academic science. The impacts are quite scary. So there's evidence that the Arab Spring, for instance, was caused by crop failure, which was precipitated by climate change 18 months previously. So there are big, crunchy issues which need to be sort of disseminated in a kind of popular and kind of sophisticated manner. And one of the things that WWF has turned to is talking to arts practitioners about how to try and best encapsulate these issues and propagate them. So we did a big event last year called Pandemonium. We commissioned a number of artists, including people like Richard Wilson and Grayson Perry, Zaha Hadid, to work within fine art kind of brief, but produce what we called wearable sculptures through a process of collaboration with an organisation, with a curators group called Artwise. We created a kind of body of about 20 pieces, which certainly kind of had a kind of obvious kind of fundraising function that we could auction them off, but actually have become part of our kind of core branded material. Another part of that has been we're moving to a new building in September of this year, and that actually kind of rehearses some of the kind of experience I had at the English National Opera when we fundraised against a new building there. We're moving into a new sustainable exemplar building, which is going to be designed by Hopkins Architects, the same people who did Glyndebourne Opera House, and it's going to involve all kinds of kind of new and innovative forms of working. We're going to have it as a kind of showcase for our work. So it's going to be a kind of hub or a platform. It's going to have a gallery space, it's going to have an auditorium, it's going to have its own wetlands, it's going to have its own education facilities. So the idea is actually it's a big discursive communicative tool, in a sense, to really kind of talk with some urgency and with some profile about what are big, imminent, urgent concerns. When you're talking to people from very different cultural contexts, who have a very different starting point in terms of all their kind of preconceptions, not just about philanthropy or marketing or communications, but also about the environment itself. So we have a very particular kind of view of the environment that isn't necessarily exactly the same as perhaps shared in other countries. We have a very particular view of attitudes to money are, for instance, very different to those that the Chinese might have. So that demands a certain kind of flexibility, a certain kind of lateral thinking, an imagination that you can put you in somebody else's shoes and really think very hard about actually, well, what are the issues here? I mean, very often those kind of communications can break down for often kind of very simple cultural reasons. So I think certainly the application of that kind of flexibility and fluidity of thinking and that kind of lateral approach is certainly something was endemic at art school and you can bring forward to working at WWF. I think the other part, I mean, there's a sort of direct correlation, which is I think the art world is inherently transnational and migratory and porous and doesn't respect national boundaries. I think the art world is inherently globalised now, and you go to something like Frieze Art Fair, you can see that very much, not just in terms of the exhibitors and where the galleries are coming from, but also in terms of who's buying the art. I think London is perhaps especially representative of that as a kind of global hub, but you can see that across the world now. I think some kind of partnership with the arts world is necessary because actually we need to paint an alternative vision which shows people that actually we're having a good time doing this, that actually a sustainable future is a positive and creative one, and that it needn't be a roundhead approach. It could be something which is actually kind of celebrates and enhances life. I think some of the things that I really value from certainly my first degree at Glasgow School of Art and then my master's at Chelsea were a sense of open-endedness, a willingness to experiment, a kind of an openness to improvisation, a willingness to fail, I think is very important, to take risks. And I think these have all been these are all sort of essential skills actually. They're pretty much applicable in any environment. I think lots of artists are good at turning something out of nothing and working on instinct and learning to find your own voice. And I think that's probably kind of some of the core values that you take forward. I always think of myself as an art school graduate. I think it's that willingness to kind of go down the less travelled path. I think giving you the confidence and the assurance to find your own voice is what art school does best.